Today we are going to talk about something incredibly niche and beautiful. Stochastic Instruments Stochastic Inspiration Generator, which is a fantastic sequencer to make generative music. While getting started with it, it's very easy and it can lead right away to very interesting results. It is quite deep, and the manual online, while very complete, isn't entirely straightforward. So I thought I would make a complete guide on how to use this thing. I'll divide this guide into the basics that you need to know to play SIG right away, but also I'm going to include some more advanced features that you can explore if you want to later in the video, and there will be the timestamps below. And just a quick note, if you're interested in the story of SIG, have a look at Molten Modular's live stream with the guys behind the project. It's a really interesting listen. As the manual says, SIG leverages tonal harmony by exploding the statistical hierarchy of pitches, which of course also means that you can break the rules and do something that Schoenberg would be proud of. And the way he does that is by assigning probability to each pitch. If you first got SIG and maybe there is already some sequence in it, one thing that I always find very useful to know about any sort of sequencer really is how to reset everything. And in SIG is quite simple. You just press run, and then while you hold it, you also press loop. And if you release it, now you're sure that there is absolutely nothing in SIG's buffer. Now we can start patching. So if you have the old version of the module, that came as a separate module with expander. So this right part used to be an expander. But if you had that version, everything I'm saying is still valid. As of now, you have all built in one module, 4 different tracks that you can select with A, B, C, and D, and you have CV outputs and trigger outputs. Although these triggers are named TREG because it's actually a mix between a trigger, an envelope, and a gate, but we'll explore that. We can start patching, and so I'm simply going from the CV output of the track A into the volt per octave input of rings, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the trigger out into the strum, which is basically the trigger input of rings. So now I can patch the even output of rings into the input of Timitsuara, which is 100% dry, same thing with beats, so I'm actually not listening to any of this stuff for now, but just rings. And if I press run, nothing will happen until I start raising some of the pitches. Let's start bringing up some Cs. There you go. So if I bring the C all the way up, I get 1 C for every 16 note. And the 16th is the default out. As you can notice here, one interesting thing that sort of confused me at the beginning is that the internal clock always spits out 16 notes. So this is actually a very slow clock. And this is the default. Even if you bring in an internal clock, the clock out will always spit out 16 notes. Sliders control the probability of each pitch to be generated at each gate out. So let's bring in some Fs maybe, and some Gs. And the horizontal row of knobs control the probability that pitch CV is generated at a specific octave. These are named with organ-like octave nomenclature. In the previous version by Omsonic, it was labeled -2, 2, -1, 0. So 8 is the default octave, but if I start bringing in some of the 16, I get both octaves. Let's change this to this algorithm. The vertical row of knobs controls the probability of each gate to have a certain musical duration. So the default is 16, but I can bring in some 8s maybe. Maybe some quarter notes. And I want to say something right away that I think it's very important. When I first started with it, I was a bit confused by the module's behavior when I started playing with it. So I had to look at the manual, and the way it works is actually quite clever, but not what I was expecting. Basically, the defaults for octave and gate duration are 0 or 8 if you have this new version, and the 16. These always trigger unless you override them somehow. If you raise any other knob for less than 100%, that particular duration or octave is actually sharing the probability of being triggered with the default. So basically, to override the default, you need to set something else to 100% or add a combination of other knobs to a some probability value of 100, if it makes sense. So if I'm back to my sequence, the only way to trigger all quarter notes, for example, would be to bring quarter notes to 100% and everything else to 0. And now it's only triggering quarter notes. And same thing with the octave. So if I want everything at this octave, I need to bring this to 100% and this to 0. Essentially, it's constantly sharing the probability of events. This is already quite cool and pretty much everything that you need to know to get started. Let's clock my delay with the clock out of SIG. Let's bring some delay in. Got cool. Gonna play with the pitches a bit. Bring some reverb in. And I can just essentially sit here and listen. It's already quite cool. This is basically jamming on the notes C, F, G, and A, assigning different probability to each pitch, which is really nice. So for example, I can change this chord into a minor one. If, for example, I start bringing in some E flats, and maybe if my A becomes flat, now I'm in C minor. Beautiful. I love the orange modes of rings. This should be enough to get you started, but let's start talking about some of the more advanced features. Specifically, let's start talking about looping and inserting rests into your sequence. Let's reset everything again. And let's start a new sequence, maybe in another key. By the way, when I'm talking about keys, for example, we were in C before and now I want to do something, let's say in A flat. Those keys are always depending to whatever is the root note that rings is tuned to, of course, and it's typical of sequencers in modulars. So I'm sure that actually rings is actually not tuned in C. If I remember well, C is somewhere around 10 o'clock, but I might be wrong, and actually I would need to tune it if I was playing with other gear, but we're not now, so who cares? But just be aware that what I'm talking C will be actually relative to the root note of rings. Let's start a new sequence. Let's say in A flat, as I said. A flat major, so it brings in some C's. Actually using the C as a root, we'll see how to change that and change the octaves of a single note. Let's bring some eighths in and some quarter notes. Let's bring back some delay. Okay, let's start explaining loop. So the way I capture a loop is simply by pressing loop and then quickly run. And this captures the 18 events that I played or that SIG played before storing the loop in the buffer. So now the loop is in the buffer, but it's actually not playing. It's sort of muted. Now if I press loop again, I now am listening to the loop. And I can change the loop length by pressing loop and using tempo to set the loop start, and I get these different steps being lit when they're on, and the 16 notes set the loop end. If I go with the loop end before the loop start, it's actually reversing the loop, so now it's reverted, which is quite cool. So let's say, for example, that we set the loop start to the first step and loop end 4 events later. So I'm only listening to 4 events. Pressing loop again switches between the loop playback and the normal stochastic playback. So this is quite cool because I can have some randomization. Let's bring some more notes in actually. Let's bring some B flat in. And then I can go back to the loop. It's very nice. Increase the loop length. Just having fun, really. Let's talk about rests. So rests obviously naturally occur in between triggers depending on the probability assigned to each pitch. But you can also specifically set the probability of rest to occur, and you do that by holding run and increasing the level of the central octave. So now I have quite a bit of rests, more. And if I put it to 100%, bring the delay down. It's interesting because basically now SIG is still selecting frequencies, but it's actually not sending triggers. So this is quite interesting because the CV output is working, and I can use it, for example, to open up a filter or to modulate something else without the notes being triggered. So that's quite an interesting, different and creative way of using rests. Now let's talk about secondary and tertiary functions. You access those using a combination of the loop and the run button and tweaking the other control. In particular, secondary functions are accessed by holding loop and changing parameters. Let's start our sequence again. Holding loop and tweaking any of the notes allows you to define a specific octave for each note, and this is quite important because obviously bass notes imply a more important harmonic way. So for example, now I'm sort of jamming in A flat or a G sharp if you want, and I do have the possibility of setting A flat to always be the bass note by lowering its individual octave, and I do that by holding loop and turning A flat down. And now my A flat always playing in the bass. Beautiful. Other functions that you access this way by holding the loop button are these A, D, P, R, and L functions. So by holding loop and tweaking A, you set the probability that the next pitch in line will be higher. So it's labeled ascend. So you get these rising melodies, or arpeggios rather. Let's bring it back down. And D is the opposite. So setting the probability that it goes down, that the next pitch in line will go down. P stands for Portamento, so we'll essentially define the probability that notes will glide. There you go. Oh, love that. R defines the probability that a single pitch will repeat. So set to 100%, it basically gets stuck on one pitch. Let's bring it down. And L is quite interesting, stands for linearity, and basically this defines the probability that the pitches are closer between each other. So if you have a scale, having these on will sound more scalar. So let's actually bring more of a scale in. So we have already quite a few notes in. Getting something interesting. Let's bring the linearity up. Oh, I put the F sharp rather than the F, that's why. Very cool. That's very nice. That's it for the secondary functions. Now let's reset our sequence so that we can start from scratch. Let's have a little jam and then we'll go into the tertiary functions. Okay, I've actually swapped a few things around because I needed something with a little more sustain and a VCA to explain some of the features of the tertiary functions. I also brought in my Mordax data so that we can have a visualization of what's happening CV-wise. As we briefly mentioned before, the trigger outputs of the SIG are actually named TREG. And the reason for this is that they can act as a trigger, they can act as a gate, or they can act as an envelope, which is a pretty cool thing. So without playing any music just yet, let me show you what I mean with this. If I start bringing in, let's say, some G, it doesn't really matter because we're not actually sending any pitch CV, and I press run, you'll see that it starts triggering notes. Right? So these look very much like very sharp envelopes or triggers. Let's decrease the time a little bit so that you can have a better look at what's happening over there on the Mordax data. Okay, and you see that you have this AD which can work as attack and decay. And as I said, these are tertiary functions that I access by holding run and tweaking the knob. So I can shape the attack, you see that I get more attack, and I can shape the decay. So I am basically getting an envelope built in the trigger, which is incredibly cool because basically saves me from having an envelope generator in my system. Let's put it in practice. So I'm going to keep this into the Mordax data so that we can have a visualization of what's happening. And I'm actually sending the audio out of this Hysteria VCO into a 2HP VCA. And then I'm going to take the out of that VCA into my Timid Zohara, which is just 100% dry, so it's not actually doing anything. Same thing with the beats. Let's put it to 100% dry and let's just get a tiny bit of reverb. And now you hear my oscillator. Let's put actually stereo in quantized mode and let's get a C as a root note. Let's choose triangular wave, it doesn't really matter. And so now if I take the CV down and I get the output of this envelope and bring it into my CV input of the VCA and bring the CV up, I'm using these both as a trigger and as an envelope generator, which is really cool. So let's increase the attack. There you go. Well, let's make it snappy again. Really cool. And now I can bring the CV in as well and bring it into the 1 volt per octave input. And I'm taking G, so let's dial in a melody or something. Let's maybe use only this octave. Let's make it snappy again. Let's bring some delay in. We need to clock the delay with the clock out of the Stochastic Inspiration Generator. Bring some reverb in. Very nice. Let's explore some of the other tertiary functions. So we already saw that pressing run and tweaking the central knob actually increases the probability that the next step is a rest, so I can get some rest in. So you see that now it's triggering less often. I can get ratchets, although now it's triggering 16 notes, and what the ratchet does is triggers 16 notes. So to actually hear the effect, let's bring in some quarter notes. And now let's increase the probability of ratchet. There you go. Now I'm getting quarter notes, but occasionally one of them is a ratchet. is again quite cool. And finally, this envelope has only attack and decay. However, I do have this legato knob over here, which is another tertiary function, which essentially allows me to bring some of the sustain in. Let's do it. You see that now it's looking more like a gate. So this control the probability that the note played is actually a constant CV. Bring the decay up a bit. Bring in some shorter values. Really fun. I could play with this thing forever. The last function that I want to talk about, which is another tertiary function which you access by holding run, is the so-called force barline mode. So without being in force barline mode, basically SIG works in a way that allows any next event to have any duration depending on whatever is the probability that you're setting. And this is pretty cool, and it can lead to very interesting results. However, there are some genres of music or specific compositions that will require for you to fit into a specific bar duration, which the free running mode won't allow you to do, because if, for example, you start with a 16 note and then the next 4 events are quarter notes and you're working in 4/4, you basically have a disaligned beat. But there is a solution to that. And the solution to that is using force barline mode, which essentially forces a new event to occur after a given 10 signatures worth of clocks. Basically, you can set up the time signature that SIG is working on. The way you do that is that in run mode, and you hold run and press tempo to select the number of events that are at the numerator of your fraction. So say if I want 4/4, I'll have to have these 4 LEDs lit. And then you use the 16 knob to work out the denominator of your time signature. So, for example, you can have quarters like this. So now SIG is running in 4/4. Can press run and start bringing in events. And that basically will make sure that my event always fit 4 beats. Obviously, this can work out very well with loops. In fact, let's do it. Let's set up a loop. Let's work on a loop length. Say something 6 events, so you can get some shifting time, which is quite cool. Change waveform. Increase the attack a little bit. Here's my loop. Lots of fun. The last thing that we need to cover is the multi-track expander, or rather what used to be an expander but is now built in into the module. This gives you access to 4 separate outputs for 4 separate tracks, which is quite cool. There are some very basic track operations. So if you remember, you reset the whole thing by holding run and then loop. This resets everything, but if you have one specific sequence on one track, you do the same, but also holding the track. So if you do this, it resets only the track. There was absolutely nothing in this track at the moment, so That's useless at the moment, but let me show you how it works. So let's bring in a basic sequence on track A. Let's do something like this. Let's go down 1 octave here. My timid Zohara is not clocked at the moment. So how about we use the output of track B to clock timid Zohara. Let's do that. So I'm on track B now. Let's bring the trigger envelope out here into my clock input of the delay of timid Zohara. And now that I'm on track B, I can dial in something, but you see that it's actually not spitting out any trigger. And the reason is that when you select a track and dial something in, this is muted by default. So if you press it, now it starts triggering stuff, and now my delay should be clocked. I love this multi-filter delay of timid Zohara. The cool thing about this is that obviously if I'm clocking a delay with it, I can get some interesting duration, so I get an irregular clock into the delay, which is something that I do a lot with delays. So now I'm getting some really interesting rhythmical events over here on track B. Another thing that you can do is that you can copy data from one track to the other, and the way you do that is by holding the source track and pressing the target track. So now I have data on my track C, I unmute it starts spitting out gates. And I can, for example, trigger seeds from my beads with track C. Nice. Going track A. Bring some of the lower octaves. How about we also use track G to freeze beads? And if you remember, these trigger envelopes can also have a level of gate with the legato function, so I can dial something in. It doesn't really matter what I'm dialing in because I'm not sending any pitch CV anyway. So let's unmute it. Now it's freezing it, but I can, for example, decide that some of it is going to be gated with the legato, so it's now lasting for longer. And now I have a rather cool granular modulated generative piece. Hello, experimental music. Very nice. This is SIG. I absolutely love this thing. It's a lot of fun. It's not the simplest module to use, but I think it can lead to very interesting and unexpected results. I really hope you enjoyed that. I didn't mention that I am not sponsored in any way by Stochastic Instruments. I bought my own module and I just think it's absolutely great. I'm gonna put a link in the description so that you can check it out if you want. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.